Welcome to the TV Street Detective Channel. Here we update cases that shock the world. John Rulloff is a strange killer, a controversial figure in American society, not only in the past, but also today. Many people believe that Rulloff is very intelligent and talented, even has all the qualities of a genius. But there are also many opinions that Rulloff is a fraud, a calculating charlatan, a desperate monomaniac. In any case, Rulloff is certainly one of the most mysterious serial killers in America. Let's explore this case with Street Detective TV. The dead bodies on the Chenango River, early on Friday morning, July 6th, 1870, on the way to work, when crossing the bridge over the Chenango River in Binghamton County, New York, a man saw something bobbing upstream, seemingly stuck on a rock. This object was wrapped in cloth, filled with water inside. This man called the people around to come closer to investigate. What they saw was the body of a man, fully clothed, lying face down in the water on the shallows of the river. The body was pulled ashore and the sheriff was called. People thought he might be involved in a recent murder that was being talked about all over town. Not far away, on the same river, another man saw something floating in the water. He rowed closer and realized it was a corpse. He wasn't too surprised. Everyone in town knew the story of a gang of thieves who had broken into the Halbert brothers' dry goods store, murdered the security guard before fleeing down the river. They might have been dead, but they might have been murdered by someone else. The townspeople gathered to watch as two bloated bodies were pulled ashore. One of the corpse's eyes had been gouged out by the hook used to pull it up. People were very happy to think that justice had been served. The murderers had been punished. At that time, there was a third body. At the Halbert store, Frederick Merrick, a young man, had died protecting the property here, mainly expensive silks. Before the case was accurately reconstructed, Gilbert Burroughs, a surviving store security guard, said that there were not only two thieves breaking into the store that night, but three. He affirmed this with certainty. Early on Wednesday morning, thieves broke into the Halbert store. The noise woke up two security guards here. Merrick took out a pistol to warn the two thieves and threw a stool at them. At that moment, the third thief appeared. He threw a chisel at Burroughs, making him dizzy. When he regained consciousness, Burroughs assisted Merrick in fighting back the thieves. Merrick grabbed one of them and pinned him down on the counter. The third man, who was holding a gun, pulled the trigger and shot Burroughs, but the bullet missed. He turned and shot Merrick in the head at close range, killing him. Burroughs ran out into the street and shouted as the robbers fled. A girl saw two robbers leave the store through the back door and head for the river. She could not determine whether they had boarded a boat or swam across. Meanwhile, another woman saw three men wading into the river. The sheriff knew that either they would find another body or the third robber was still alive. If this was true, he was eager to find him. In the chaos and rush to find a doctor, people had not noticed a man as he left town. They did not know that they were very close to the person who had participated in the failed robbery, even as the authorities were arresting suspects in town. Before the two bodies were discovered in the river, the man was followed as he wandered the streets. Because he was a stranger, some young men followed him. The man jumped onto a train to shake them off, but he could not escape. The group cornered him and forced him to follow them back to town, where he was put in jail with two other suspects. The man tried to tear his clothes to hide the evidence, but the front of his shirt was stained with blood. When the two bodies were neatly arranged, the suspects were brought in for identification. The other two said they did not know them and did not appear to be lying. The stranger, however, remained calm, looking at the two bodies from different angles. He told the jury his name was Charles Augustus, but later said it was George Williams. These were suspicious but had no obvious connection to the murder. There was no reason to detain this man, even though someone recognized him as Edward Rulloff, who had been accused of murdering his wife and children. Rulloff admitted his identity and explained that he had to pretend because in this town, if a murder occurred, people would suspect him because he was a stranger. For that reason, he was temporarily released. Following the trace, the next task was to establish the identities of the thieves. Detectives found several items in their pockets that could help them find clues. Bailey listed the items as 6 keys, a letter addressed to a man named Henry Wilson, a piece of paper with the name and address of a Brooklyn lawyer named William Thornton. In addition, the thieves' pockets contained a special small book called Napoleon's Oraculum, Book of Fate. The book offers a method of predicting the future by receiving a mysterious energy through a series of dots and lines. It is said that Napoleon consulted this book frequently and attributed his success to its instructions. This book was also found in Napoleon's drawer after his defeat at Leipzig. In 1801, a French expedition took the book from a pharaoh's tomb. The book had been copied, and the one found in the thieves' pockets was a well-used copy. There was another item left in the basement of the halbert's shop that turned out to be more interesting than the previous finds. It was a pair of men's shoes made for a man with a deformed left foot. The halberts knew nothing about the shoes, so investigators considered the possibility that they had been left by the killer. However, the feet of the 2 drowned thieves were normal, indicating that they were not theirs, although the sheriff later admitted that he had not tried the shoes on the corpses. Back to Rulloff, after he had left, someone remembered that he was missing a big toe and had some unusual bumps on the instep. The shoes found in the basement of the halbert's shop seemed to fit such a deformed foot. The police rushed out to find Rulloff and found him walking very fast, as if he wanted to get as far away from Binghamton as possible. Rulloff was led back to town, and like in the Cinderella story, he was asked to try on the shoe. It fit Rulloff perfectly. However, this was not enough evidence to convict anyone of murder. Once again, it seemed that the police would have to let Rulloff go free. Another item found in Rulloff's pocket was a train ticket to Batavia, while the 2 drowned men had tickets there. But this could also be a coincidence and could not be considered evidence to convict anyone. Investigators thought that if they knew the identities of the 2 drowned thieves, they could answer the question of whether Rulloff had any connection to them. So they focused on clarifying this issue, and at the same time did not allow Rulloff to leave. First, the investigators visited a lawyer named William Thornton in Brooklyn. The lawyer looked at the photo of the 2 robbers' bodies provided by the investigators and identified one as Billy Dexter. He did not know the other man, but gave the police Dexter's address. On this visit, the investigators were confirmed by a woman who identified Dexter and also provided the name of a colleague of his, Miss Edward Howard. She received a photo of Dexter in a photo provided by the police, which also showed Rulloff. This was the first connection between Rulloff and the 2 robbers. The investigators went to Rulloff's place of residence and obtained a lot of useful information from objects that linked Rulloff and Dexter. They also found a manuscript that Rulloff was writing, which later became part of the case, and they identified the other thief. It was Albert Jarvis. It turned out that Jarvis was the son of a prison warden, and he first met Rulloff when Rulloff was serving his sentence. It seemed that they had formed a friendship that lasted for many years, and ultimately ended tragically for Jarvis himself. Jarvis listened to every plan that Rulloff proposed, knowing that he was intelligent and talented. Rulloff easily led the young man down the path of crime. When they found the connection between Rulloff, Dexter, and Jarvis, it was not too difficult for the investigators to discover that Rulloff was the mastermind of the failed robbery, and also the culprit who shot and killed the young man Merrick. This was not the first time Rulloff had killed, but in previous cases he had escaped punishment. The public hoped that this time would be different, that Rulloff would be punished appropriately. District Attorney Peter Hopkins was assigned to handle Rulloff's case. He began by investigating his criminal past. Who was John Rulloff? Rulloff's grandfather was Rulloff Rulloffson, the head of a family in the German community in New Jersey, who later moved to Nova Scotia. Rulloff was born in 1821 as John Edward Howard Rulloffson. He was the eldest of 3 brothers. His 2 younger brothers later left home to find their own lives. With a gentle personality, Rulloff attracted people. Most people who met Rulloff were impressed by his intelligence, his brilliant intelligence. Rulloff had many jobs as a therapist, investor, teacher. He even studied primitive psychology, a study of human skull shape, popular in the early 19th century. Rulloff probably could not have imagined that one day he would be the subject of this research. To promote himself, Rulloff considered himself a linguist, a new trend in his time. In that trend, people competed to study the structure and composition of languages, especially the origin of words and similarities between different languages. Rulloff spent his days and nights studying Latin and Greek, searching for codes, just to answer the question of what language meant. Rulloff fell into poverty after spending too much time and effort writing Method in the Formation of Language, which he considered the most important book for mankind. Rulloff taught himself many languages at different levels to understand the origins of thought and communication. He believed that knowledge of language would help people answer the question of what humans are and where they came from. In this aspect, he was a researcher no one could deny, and that work also consumed a lot of his time. When he finished writing Method in the Formation of Language, Rulloff offered it for sale for $500,000, believing that it would make him one of the most famous and outstanding people of all time. This is a testament to Rulloff's arrogance and false sense of self-worth. On the one hand, he presented his results as ordinary, while on the other hand, he used every opportunity to pour out academic words to impress new acquaintances. However, no one offered to buy his books. Why Rulloff did not succeed in making money seemed to him a mystery. As a young man, Rulloff had been a clerk in a dry goods store, where he was recorded as having stolen goods and started several fires. After serving his first prison term, Rulloff assumed another alias and returned to civilian life. He did not learn his lesson, but became more cunning. After wandering around a few places, Rulloff went to the home of the Will Schutt family in Dryden County, New York, and in 1843 married Will's sister Harriet. Rulloff was a jealous man and immediately suspected that his wife was in love with another man. Rulloff used this as an excuse to beat Harriet, but she did not complain. In 1845, they had a daughter, Priscilla, but that did not help matters. Rulloff continued to prove himself to be a difficult husband to live with. In May, Will's wife Amelia and their newborn daughter fell ill. Will, knowing that Rulloff had some basic knowledge of medicine and herbs, asked him for help. Rulloff cared for both mother and child, but their illnesses did not improve. In June, the baby died, and Amelia died shortly after. Will was devastated by the loss, but did not suspect anything about the deaths of his wife and child. He assumed that they had succumbed to the common illnesses that women and children suffered after childbirth, as well as the harsh winters of upstate New York. However, because Rulloff had hinted at a grudge against Will, some people believed that he had poisoned Will's wife and children in revenge. Suspicions about Rulloff were further raised when, that same month, just 2 weeks after Will's wife and children's sad funeral, Rulloff's wife and children suddenly disappeared. Harriet was last seen on June 23rd when she went to a neighbor's house. The last people who had contact with Harriet said that she had shown no signs of an upcoming trip. Rulloff could not escape suspicion about the sudden disappearance of his wife and children. The cruel husband. One evening, Rulloff and Harriet had an argument about their family's future plans. Rulloff wanted to move west to find a better job, while Harriet wanted to stay close to her relatives. Years later, Rulloff told Ham Freeman that they had argued about their child. In a fit of rage, Rulloff grabbed a pestle used to pound tobacco and hit his wife on the head. He hit Harriet, breaking her head and knocking her to the floor. Rulloff tried to revive her and bandage her wound, but Harriet remained unconscious and died that night. After that, Rulloff made up many stories about Harriet running away from home. Rulloff never told anyone about his daughter, except that he gave her sleeping pills to stop her from crying. Rulloff also said that after killing his wife, he intended to kill himself, but in the end, he did not do so. Instead, Rulloff put the bodies of his wife and child in a large trunk, borrowed a horse-drawn cart from a Korean, and drove them to the cemetery .G neighbor and took the bodies to an unknown location. He returned to the house the next day, returned the carriage to the neighbor, and said nothing. Rulloff then told everyone that he was going away before leaving with his books and unfinished manuscript. A month later, curious people decided to break into Rulloff's house. They found no signs of a long trip. which was not like Harriet's character. The dress she was wearing on the last day she was seen was thrown on the floor. At that time, no one knew where Rulloff was. In response to Rulloff's sudden disappearance, neighbours suspected that he might have killed his wife and children, so they organised an armed search party to find him. At this time, Rulloff returned to town as if nothing had happened. When asked about Harriet, he said that his wife was in the Cayuga Lake area. Rulloff was surprised to hear that people were talking about him as a murderer. Rulloff then went to his wife's relatives, assuring them that everything was fine. But unlike his neighbours, Rulloff told Harriet's relatives that the family had moved to Ohio. Not everyone believed Rulloff's story. One of Harriet's brothers asked Rulloff to take him to see his sister. He agreed to let them write to Harriet, but then disappeared. They found Rulloff and asked him to take him to see Harriet. Rulloff did not take well to this coercion, so when he reached Ohio, he ran away again. Immediately, a warrant was issued for Rulloff's arrest. Rulloff was arrested and taken to Ithaca for custody. At this point, the authorities confirmed that Harriet was dead and announced a reward for anyone who could find her and her daughter. District Attorney Peter Hopkins prepared the case against Rulloff. Rulloff's trial began in early 1846. However, there was no body to prove his guilt, despite a vigorous police search of Cayuga Lake. Since it was impossible to prove that Harriet and her daughter had been murdered, their disappearance was sufficient to charge Rulloff with the lesser crime of kidnapping Harriet and her daughter. Rulloff, who was well versed in the law, argued with the authorities in an attempt to avoid legal punishment, but was unsuccessful. Rulloff had no defense, other than that there was insufficient evidence to charge him with murder. He gave his attorney instructions on what to say, but several members of the jury agreed that Rulloff should be imprisoned for something, even if he was not the murderer. The jury eventually convicted Rulloff and sentenced him to 10 years in Auburn prison. His time in prison was not pleasant, but as usual, Rulloff spent his time acquiring knowledge, something that would serve him well when he got out. Those who knew him found him to be a hard-nosed man, ready to retaliate for petty offences, but a man who played by the rules and forced himself to do whatever the law required. Rulloff learned a lot and thought about his future plans. Escaping the law. During Rulloff's 10 years in prison, the search for Harriet and Priscilla's bodies continued. In 1856, as Rulloff was awaiting his release from prison, a warrant was issued for his involvement in Harriet's death. The police took Rulloff back to Ithaca. There, Rulloff argued with District Attorney John A. Williams that this was a double conviction, meaning he was tried twice for the same crime, and Attorney Williams was forced to stop prosecuting Rulloff. However, in response to the strong public reaction, Williams issued another indictment related to Priscilla's death. Rulloff maintained his innocence, and his defense attorney's request to change the trial venue was approved. The trial then took place in Owego, Tioga County, New York. While Rulloff was in prison, the authorities worked hard to gather evidence. They tracked Rulloff's every move. From the moment he left the home he shared with his wife and children, the suitcases that Rulloff was carrying were found in Chicago, containing children's clothes. In addition, there was psychological evidence. Rulloff's lies, his evasions, his fabrications, his various aliases, and his unusual behaviour were all used against him. At this trial, while acknowledging that someone's disappearance was not enough evidence to convict a suspect in a murder, the jury considered whether a person could be convicted of murder without a body, a thorny legal issue at the time. Daniel Dickinson, the prosecutor, argued that circumstantial evidence was sufficient, even without a body, and while the jury was still debating this point, Rulloff was led return to prison. There, Rulloff learned that the court had favoured a guilty verdict and that he would remain in custody awaiting sentencing. During this time, Rulloff became acquainted with 16-year-old Albert Jarvis, the jailer's son. Jarvis would later become an important card in Rulloff's plans. Jarvis's parents had no qualms about the prisoner teaching their son Latin and ancient Greek. They considered Rulloff to be an educated man, even though he might be a murderer, and that Rulloff's behaviour was unlikely to affect their son. They clearly underestimated the cunning of a psychopath. Rulloff spent a lot of time with Jarvis, who later came to regard him as a father figure. Rulloff also tried to curry favor with Havis's father by writing a biography of him, and gradually won over Havis's mother, who was said to have fallen in love with him. In the spring of 1857, Rulloff escaped from prison. A seemingly impossible feat. Escape from a chain around his ankle and 8 locks on the door, without help from the inside. A $500 reward was immediately offered for Rulloff's capture. Flyers announcing his identity were distributed throughout the county. A local newspaper reported that a visitor had given Rulloff a large sum of money. Jarvis also confirmed that a visitor had come and asked questions about Rulloff. Jarvis's father was then fired. Jarvis was prosecuted for helping Rulloff escape. The reward was increased to $1,250. Unfortunately for Rulloff, while on the run, he accidentally appeared in a photo of someone and was recognized as a wanted man. It turned out that Rulloff had not left Ithaca. Soon after, Rulloff moved west to Ohio. Discovering the wanted man, a group of farmers surrounded Rulloff. He tried to convince the farmers that they were mistaken, but no one believed him, and they wanted the reward money. Rulloff could not resist, and the farmers turned him over to the Ithaca police. Knowing that he could not escape, Rulloff returned to his old cell with more secure locks. Unable to convict Rulloff of murdering his wife and children, prosecutors turned to the suspicion that Rulloff had poisoned Amelia Schutt, his wife's sister-in-law, and her child. Amelia Schutt's body was exhumed for examination. Copper deposits were found on the tissues, and it was determined that the substance had been introduced into Amelia Schutt's body from outside. But the investigation ultimately went nowhere. Beyond rumors and suspicions, the deaths of Amelia Schutt and her mother could never be attributed to Rulloff. In early 1859, a new trial was held for Rulloff. However, the prosecutor understood that there was little hope for a different outcome because they had not found new evidence. Rulloff was acquitted again. After Rulloff was released, Jarvis turned to him in an attempt to make money for his mother and himself. The murderer's education. Rulloff moved to Pittsburgh, claiming to be an Oxford scholar and getting a teaching job. But he soon returned to New York, and Jarvis committed a number of petty thefts. Rulloff was sentenced to 2 years in prison for burglary, and during this time met William T. Dexter, another burglar who was serving a sentence. After being released from prison, Rulloff, Javis and Dexter formed a group. Havis and Dexter were only 20 years old, so the group relied on Rulloff's age, experience and intelligence to plan business plans. One of them was the burglary of the Halbert store in Binghamton. The burglary was a failure with 3 lives. Rulloff did not die, but was under a lot of pressure. Rulloff's trial resumed on January 4th, 1871. The information was published in the New York Times, and every day, up to 2,000 people came to watch the trial, doubling the capacity of the courtroom. Apparently, the story of Rulloff had spread far and wide, even attracting the attention of foreign press. Rulloff was charged with burglary and first-degree murder. Rulloff was sentenced to be hanged on March 3rd, 1871. When he returned to prison, Rulloff continued to attract the curiosity of many people. He was considered to have an extraordinary intellect, and some scholars even wanted to correspond with Rulloff. Day by day, Rulloff's name spread further and further. Many people were curious about Rulloff's so-called linguistic theory. People flocked to the prison just to see him, while Rulloff spent all day writing and poring over books as if nothing could disturb him. Even when the sheriff announced the hanging, Rulloff was still busy explaining his ideas to reporters. Therefore, many intellectuals asked the question, between being hanged and doing research, which was more suitable for Rulloff. Regarded by Rulloff as a highly skilled and accomplished linguist, many people sent letters to Rulloff in prison, asking him to help them with their research. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to explore shocking true crime stories, unsolved mysteries, and secrets yet to be uncovered. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new videos. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue bringing exciting, high-quality content. Thank you for joining us on this journey.